I gave up counting my years on this bench a long time ago. These days, I measure time in faces instead. The ones who walked in defiant and walked out humbled by something they never saw coming. The ones who walked in broken and walked out carrying a piece of self-worth they hadn't come looking for. And every so often, a face that rides home with me in the passenger seat and doesn't leave for weeks. Quick thing before I get into this one. If these stories mean something to you, go ahead and subscribe now. It genuinely helps me keep telling them. And this is one of the ones I think about the most. I want to say something plainly because it matters for everything that follows. This is not a story about a bad kid. I don't believe in that phrase. I've never believed in it. In all my years looking young people in the eye from this bench, I have not once met a child who arrived in this world simply wired for cruelty. What I have met, more times than I can count, are children who were let down. By circumstance, by absent adults, by grown-ups too fractured or too exhausted or too afraid to do the unglamorous, thankless work of actually raising them. Marcus Webb was one of those children. What happened the morning he stood in my courtroom, what was said, what finally landed, and the quiet, unannounced transformation that unfolded across 10 Saturdays in an old woman's backyard is a story worth telling with care. So that's exactly how I'm going to tell it. A boy with 40,000 followers and nobody willing to say no. Marcus was 13 years old, and by the only measurement he cared about, he'd already arrived. 40,000 subscribers on a channel built entirely on mocking authority, glamorizing rule-breaking, and turning defiance into a punchline. He had a genuine eye for editing, a real sense of comedic rhythm, talent that, in a different household, under different mentorship, might have gone somewhere worth going. Instead, it went completely unsupervised, feeding on whatever got the loudest reaction. His mother, Diane Webb, worked as an office administrator and was still quietly trying to rebuild herself in the aftermath of a divorce 2 years prior. I want to be careful here, because I'm not interested in flattening Diane into a villain. Separation dismantles people in ways that take years to put back together. And raising a child completely alone is one of the loneliest jobs a human being can take on. But somewhere inside all of that wreckage, Diane had stopped functioning as Marcus's parent and started functioning as his shield. His personal defense attorney against a world she'd convinced herself was constantly misreading her son. When teachers raised concerns, she questioned the school's competence. When he was suspended 3 separate times across 18 months, she told anyone who'd listen that the administration simply didn't understand strong-willed boys. When neighbors showed up at her door, she offered soft, non-committal apologies and went back inside, and nothing ever actually changed. Quietly, without telling anyone, she'd already paid out roughly $5,000 combined to 2 separate families just to keep earlier incidents from becoming official complaints. In her own mind, she was protecting her son. In practice, she was teaching him, one settlement at a time, that consequences were always negotiable if you had someone willing to write the check. The warning signs weren't hidden. They were sitting in a folder somewhere, ignored. A school counselor had recommended outside intervention in writing. 2 separate teachers had submitted reports describing a pattern that went well past ordinary mischief, a tendency to specifically target people who seemed vulnerable, isolated, or unlikely to push back. Diane had read every one of those reports and tucked them away somewhere she'd never have to look at them again, because facing them honestly would have meant becoming the parent Marcus resented. She was terrified of that. I understand that fear intimately. I've watched it sit in the chair across from me more times than I can count. But I also know precisely where that fear tends to lead if nobody interrupts it. Now let me tell you about Margaret Okafor, because she deserves to be introduced properly, not as a footnote in someone else's story. 74 years old, a retired elementary school librarian who spent 28 years helping children find the exact right book at the exact right moment in their lives. Work that is, I promise you, far more demanding than most people assume. She'd emigrated from Nigeria as a young woman and spent 5 careful decades building a life on this soil, one relationship and one small kindness at a time. Her English carried the precise, musical cadence of where she came from, something she wore without a shred of apology and every bit of pride. Her husband, Charles, had died of a stroke 4 years before any of this reached my desk. They'd shared 37 years of marriage. Charles was the sort of man who, the week he moved into any new house, went out and planted something in the yard, not because he had time to spare, but because he genuinely believed a home wasn't complete without something alive growing beside it. He'd put the first plantings into that soil back in 1986, working with his bare hands, still learning the ground he was standing on. Over nearly 4 decades, what started as a modest corner of greenery grew into something people would drive across town to see. Rare cultivars he'd sourced from specialty growers over the years, colors that seemed to test the limits of what a flower was supposed to look like. Burgundy fading into violet, cream petals edged in a gold so faint you had to lean in to notice it. Professional botanists had approached him more than once, offering real money for cuttings. Charles always just smiled and turned them down. You don't sell what love grew. That was the whole of his answer, every time. After Charles passed, Margaret kept tending that garden with the same steady devotion she brought to everything in her life, because maintaining what he'd built felt like staying in conversation with him. Every single morning at 6, without fail, she brewed her tea, changed into her garden clothes, and spent her early hours pruning, watering, and talking quietly to Charles. The way you talk to someone you know is still somehow nearby. Her neighbors had learned, without ever being told twice, not to knock before 9. Those hours were hers, protected, non-negotiable. A number of the plants had traveled with her all the way from her family's compound in Lagos. Cuttings her own grandmother had kept alive for years, tying Margaret not only to Charles, but to soil on another continent that had shaped every version of who she eventually became. When I think about what Marcus Webb destroyed, I don't think in terms of a dollar figure. I think about all of that layered, decades-deep history rooted quietly in one unremarkable backyard that nobody driving past would have looked at twice. Marcus and Diane had moved in 2 doors down, roughly 14 months before this case landed on my desk. The early friction was nothing unusual. Ordinary noise, ordinary boundary testing, the kind every neighborhood absorbs eventually. Margaret understood children. She'd spent nearly 3 decades surrounded by them and had more patience than most people are built with. But Marcus operated differently than the average difficult kid. Every limit he found wasn't an ending. It was simply a launching point for whatever came next, and nobody in his orbit was pulling him back from the edge of it. It started small, the way these things usually do. A basketball, thrown repeatedly against her back fence, always during her protected morning hours. When she gently suggested he might shift his playing to the afternoon, he stared her down for a long beat and threw it harder. Then came the litter, garbage tossed deliberately over the fence into her flower beds. She went to Diane. Diane apologized. Nothing changed. Then Marcus discovered her accent, and something in him seemed to light up around it. He began filming her without her knowledge, through gaps in the fence slats, from an upstairs window, catching private moments when she believed she was completely alone, humming to herself while she worked. He posted the clips online with captions like, "My unhinged neighbor," and "Why do old people act like this?" The comments filled up with laughing emojis and strangers piling on. A woman who had spent nearly 3 decades helping children fall in love with language, who had spent years quietly tutoring immigrant families in reading comprehension after hours, had become the punchline for a 13-year-old who had never once had to work hard at anything in his entire life. She went back to Diane. Another apology. Another video posted the following week, as if nothing had been said at all. What happened next was not a prank, and I want that stated clearly for the record. Diane reached for that exact word repeatedly in my courtroom, and every single time I corrected her, because language matters here. What Marcus did was a criminal act, deliberate, planned well in advance, and documented on video specifically for entertainment value. Margaret woke at 6, as always. Brewed her tea, as always. Put on Charles's old canvas garden jacket, the one she'd never been able to make herself give away. Stepped through the back door into the cool morning air, and found her plants dead. Not wilting, not struggling. Dead. The specific, Total kind of death that only happens when something catastrophic has been introduced overnight and left to finish its work. Blackened at the stems, collapsed at the blooms, the soil beneath them visibly discolored. Someone had gone plant to plant with a concentrated commercial herbicide, methodical and thorough, making absolutely certain nothing had a chance to survive. She knelt down in that ruined soil and wept. Not the composed, contained grief of someone who's learned to hold herself together in public, but the kind that comes apart completely. The grief of someone whose last living, growing connection to the person she loved most had just been deliberately, intentionally severed by a stranger's hand. Her niece found her there 40 minutes later, still kneeling. She might never have known who was responsible, except Marcus posted the footage himself the very next morning, as though it were simply another episode. He'd filmed the entire thing, climbing the fence in the dark, narrating in an upbeat, breezy commentary voice, pointing out which plants he was targeting next, laughing about how Margaret would react when she eventually found them. He captioned it something close to, "Getting back at my annoying neighbor Lol. Old people are so easy to mess with." 40,000 people watched it within a day. 4 of them happened to know Margaret personally. They were the ones who sent her the screenshots. When Margaret first showed me that recording, when I sat and watched a 13-year-old boy laugh his way through the deliberate annihilation of a widow's garden, narrating his own cruelty like it was a punchline, I felt something I don't often let myself feel from this bench. Quiet, controlled, but real, unmistakable anger. Margaret had never once pursued legal action in her life, not for anything. Charles had always believed conflict belonged in conversation, not courtrooms, and she'd carried that instinct with her for the better part of 7 decades. But this was different, and she knew it was different. Marcus had committed a crime, filmed it, published it for an audience, and his mother had responded with exactly nothing. Margaret filed a police report. Juvenile probation opened a file of its own. She also filed in small claims court, seeking $18,600 for the destroyed plantings and $750 for emotional distress, a figure that 3 separate horticultural consultants independently told her drastically undersold her actual loss. A root system built patiently over 38 years cannot simply be replicated with a nursery receipt. The specimens Charles had cultivated from cuttings across decades were, in every meaningful sense, irreplaceable. You could go buy new plants. You could not go buy back 38 years. What Margaret didn't know, what nobody in that first hearing knew yet, was what my review team turned up once Marcus Webb's file crossed my desk. Something in it stopped me cold enough that I asked them to dig further, past the surface of the complaint. What they found wasn't a single isolated incident at all. It was a documented, years-long pattern. The 2 prior settlements Diane had quietly paid to make problems disappear: the school records, the counselor's written evaluations, the intervention recommendations from 18 months earlier that had simply gone unaddressed, sitting in a drawer somewhere gathering dust. A young man genuinely in trouble, cushioned at every single turn from the exact accountability that might have redirected him before any of this happened. I spent 2 full evenings reading that file cover to cover. I walked into my courtroom the morning of Marcus's hearing, carrying something I don't often carry with me onto this bench. Not performed severity, not theater, but actual anger. The kind that only shows up after you've traced a long chain of entirely avoidable harm back to its root and realized, with real clarity, that it never had to travel this far. That somewhere along that chain, some adult should have held the line and simply didn't. Quick reminder while we're in the thick of it. Subscribe if you haven't yet, because the second half of this one is the part that actually changed how I think about accountability. Margaret entered the courtroom first that morning, moving with the careful, deliberate pace of someone whose joints have spent 5 decades kneeling in garden soil. She wore a modest wrap dress she'd owned for years, still immaculately kept. Her niece walked beside her, carrying a folder of evidence, before and after photographs, still frames pulled from Marcus's own video, written statements from horticultural consultants, and one small, worn photograph of Charles kneeling in that same soil back in 1986, pressing the very first roots into the ground with his bare hands. She'd brought that photograph specifically so I would understand the full weight of what had actually been lost here, beyond any number on a claim form. I looked at it for a long moment. I understood. Then Marcus and Diane came through the doors, and the entire energy of the room shifted. Marcus moved through the space the exact way certain teenagers move through rooms where accountability has never felt like it applies to them. Headphones on, phone held at eye level, thumb scrolling. He didn't acknowledge the bailiff. He didn't so much as glance toward Margaret, seated 20 feet away. He found his chair and dropped into it with the boneless, practiced ease of someone who genuinely believed he had nothing to answer for. Diane trailed just behind him, whispering close to his shoulder, reaching for some last scrap of parental authority. He shrugged her off each time, without so much as turning his head. I watched all of it without saying a word. I've done this work long enough now to read a room within about 10 seconds of it walking through my doors. What I read that morning was a boy who had never once, in 13 years, been made to take anything seriously, and a mother who no longer believed, deep down, that she had the standing left to make him. I called the hearing to order and gave the floor to Mrs. Okafor. Her voice held steady through the early portions of her testimony, then cracked, just slightly, when she reached the part where she described stepping outside and finding the garden. She presented the photographs, the before images, extraordinary specimens tended across decades of quiet, patient devotion. The after images, blackened stems, collapsed petals, soil visibly ruined by chemical. She played Marcus's own video on the courtroom monitor. The room went silent in that particular. Heavy way rooms go silent when everyone in it is processing the same thing at once. Throughout all of it, Marcus sat with one earbud still in. He rolled his eyes when her voice wavered. He exhaled, audibly, when she described Charles pressing those first roots into the soil by hand nearly 40 years earlier. The microphone near the defense table caught what he muttered under his breath, something close to so overdramatic. His mother closed her eyes and didn't open them again for a long moment. I asked Marcus to put the phone away. He complied with the exaggerated slowness of a teenager performing reluctant cooperation for an audience, sliding it into his pocket with movements calibrated to communicate contempt through the smallest possible gesture. One earbud came out. The other stayed in, dangling, deliberately. I noted that too, quietly, in my own way. Diane began her defense along familiar lines. Marcus was, at heart, a good kid who'd made one terrible error in judgment. Mrs. Okafor was overstating the significance of the whole thing. At the end of the day, plants were just plants, replaceable. He was only 13. His understanding of real-world consequences was still developing. Social media, she said, had warped his sense of where the line even was. They'd had serious conversations at home, real ones, about respect. I listened to every word of it. Then I told her directly, at 13 years old, children absolutely understand the difference between right and wrong. Her son hadn't stumbled into this by accident. He had conceived of it, carried it out, filmed it, published it for a public audience, and laughed on camera while an elderly woman was reduced to tears in front of thousands of strangers. This was not a social media literacy problem. This was cruelty, staged deliberately for an audience. I turned to Marcus and asked whether he understood that what he'd done was wrong. He met my eyes with the particular expression of someone being asked to explain something they consider slightly beneath them. I mean, he said, with a small shrug, they're literally just plants. She can get more. It's not that serious. The courtroom went completely still. That specific silence that happens when a room full of people can't quite process what they've just heard and holds its breath waiting to see what comes next. Not that serious, I repeated slowly. You destroyed something irreplaceable, and to you, it's not that serious. And Marcus Webb, 13 years old, emboldened by a lifetime's worth of consequences that had always dissolved somewhere before ever reaching him, looked at me with mild, genuine impatience and said, "Whatever. Adults are so sensitive about everything." He even glanced faintly toward an imaginary lens, already composing the caption in his head. I looked at him for a long moment and said nothing. What I've learned across many years on this bench is that the single most important thing you can do in a moment like that isn't to react right away. Let the silence take up the whole room. Let everyone in it feel the full weight of what was just said. And only then, once you finally do speak, make absolutely certain you mean every word of it. Here's what I told him, word for word. And I'm going to say it to you the same way I said it to him that morning. You are 13 years old, and you are already on a course toward becoming someone nobody chooses to be near. I'm not saying that to be cruel to you. I'm saying it because it happens to be true, and because you clearly need at least one person in your life willing to tell you the truth instead of managing around it. Your mother loves you. I can see that plainly, sitting right here. But she has failed you by never once teaching you that your actions carry real weight, that they land on other human beings in real, lasting ways. That failure isn't something you built yourself, but you are the one who has to live inside it now, and you are the one who is going to have to rebuild from it, piece by piece. You believe your subscribers make you significant. They don't. They are watching you perform, nothing more. The moment you stop being entertaining to them, they will move on without a single backward thought. They don't know you. They have never once cared about you. And right now, today, the content you're so proud of is you causing real, lasting harm to a 74-year-old woman who has never once done a single thing to you. A woman who lost her husband, who walks into that garden every single morning of her life because it is the only way she still has of staying close to someone she misses every single day she's alive. You thought that was funny. I am telling you, plainly, that it was not. I then laid out, for the full record, everything my team had uncovered. The 2 prior settlements Diane had paid quietly to make things disappear. The roughly $5,000 spent making problems go away instead of solving them. The school documentation, the counselor's evaluations, the intervention recommendations that had been left sitting on a shelf for a year and a half, untouched. Every single piece of it landed on Diane like something solid and heavy. For what looked like the first time, she was seeing the entire shape of what her approach had actually produced, all of it assembled in one place at once, impossible to look away from. Marcus had gone pale by then. Whatever indifference had been sitting on his face when he walked in had left it completely. I told him about the garden in full detail. Charles pressing those first roots into soil back in 1986. The cuttings Margaret had carried across an ocean from her family's home in Lagos. Her grandmother's plants, living connections to a country, to a lineage, to an origin story that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with who Margaret was before he ever knew her name. I told him what the horticultural consultant had said, that the dollar figure on the claim form was a fraction of the actual loss. That some things, once they're gone, are simply gone, permanently, no matter what number you attach to them afterward. That's something worth understanding now, while you're still young enough for it to genuinely shape the rest of how you move through the world. I awarded Mrs. Okafor the full amount she had requested, but by that point, the financial judgment was easily the least significant part of what came next. Marcus would personally restore Margaret Okafor's garden with his own hands. 40 hours of physical labor spread across 10 consecutive Saturdays, supervised the entire time by a court-appointed mediator with no device of any kind permitted during any session. He would be physically present week after week in the exact space he had destroyed, doing the slow work of putting it back together piece by piece. He would compose a formal written apology. No digital assistance of any kind, no ghostwriting from his mother, his own words, in his own handwriting. His YouTube channel would be permanently closed, effective immediately. Every piece of content featuring Mrs. Okafor removed from the internet without delay. He would be prohibited from all social platforms for 6 months, with the court actively monitoring for compliance the entire time. And Diane would personally enforce every single condition of this order or face contempt charges of her own. Marcus listened. He had no phone to disappear into. He simply sat in the dirt, hour after hour, and heard a 74-year-old woman talk honestly about her life for the first time in his own. On the 6th Saturday, almost shyly, he asked if she would teach him a few words in Yoruba. She laughed, a real, surprised laugh that seemed to catch even her off guard, and said yes, of course she would. On the 9th Saturday, he arrived carrying a small potted plant in a paper bag. Nothing rare, nothing expensive. Just a modest cutting he'd picked out himself at a local nursery after asking one of the staff what might grow well alongside everything Margaret already had established. She found a spot for it that same morning. In a corner of the garden, she realized she'd been quietly leaving open for weeks without ever quite knowing why. On the final Saturday, once the mediator had signed the completion paperwork and the court order was officially satisfied, Marcus didn't leave right away. He stayed an extra hour on his own time, unasked, to finish a section he'd started the week before and hadn't wanted to leave half done. When he finally gathered his things and reached the gate, he turned. Not toward the mediator, not toward the yard in general, but specifically toward Margaret, and told her he was sorry. Not the formal written apology, carefully composed weeks earlier and technically sufficient to satisfy the order. This was different, shorter, unscripted. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't understand what I was doing." And then he left, quietly, the way he'd arrived that very first morning. Margaret told me about that exact moment some months later when I happened to run into her at a community event across town. She was smiling when she told it to me. She said she believed him completely. People ask me sometimes why I keep doing this work after so many years on this bench. The cases are often draining. The stories are frequently painful to sit through. You witness a tremendous amount of harm that genuinely didn't have to unfold the way it did. Damage that could have been stopped entirely if just one adult, somewhere earlier in the chain, had made a different choice at the right moment. But you also get to see this. A young person headed somewhere genuinely wrong, turned around before it was too late. A woman with every conceivable justification for lasting bitterness, choosing patience instead, over and over, week after week. A garden, slowly and stubbornly, coming back to life. I don't think of what happened in my courtroom that day as any kind of victory. Nobody involved walked away whole. Margaret Okafor lost specimens that Charles had grown, patiently, over nearly 4 decades of his life. No ruling I hand down, no apology, no number of Saturday hours logged gives any of that back to her. Not really. She absorbed that permanent loss with more grace than most people I've ever met could manage to find. What I believe happened, what I sincerely hope happened, is that Marcus Webb received a genuine, hard-won second chance. The specific kind that only arrives when someone finally respects you enough to tell you the unfiltered truth, and then requires you to sit with that truth in the dirt for 10 consecutive Saturdays, with absolutely no audience and no comfort of performance to hide behind. He was 13. He'd been failed repeatedly by adults who were supposed to guide him in ways he never chose for himself and couldn't have controlled even if he'd wanted to. He still has a long road in front of him, but he was still young enough, that particular year, for the direction of that road to change. Still young enough for the lesson to actually take hold, slowly, without any announcement, the exact way cuttings take hold in unfamiliar soil, until one ordinary morning you look outside and notice, almost by accident, that something is actually undeniably alive. What no bench can do, and what no ruling I write will ever be able to do, is love a child into becoming someone better. That kind of work requires an actual person, willing to be physically present in the garden with them, Saturday after Saturday, answering small questions, correcting pronunciation, leaving just enough room for one more small plant in a space that had somehow, quietly, been waiting the whole time. Margaret Okafor did that. And I believe, all these years later, that it mattered more than anything I ever said from this bench. If this one stayed with you the way it stayed with me, go ahead and subscribe. There are quite a few more of these worth telling, and I'll be back with the next one soon.